The CEO's wife smiled at me, the way people do when they've already decided you don't belong. Crystal glasses clinked softly across the ballroom. A string quartet played somewhere behind the velvet curtains, blending into the low hum of confident conversations. This was the kind of room where deals were already considered finished before the ink ever touched paper. And then she looked at me. Lillian Carrington tilted her head slightly, her eyes moving from my shoes to my face with slow, deliberate judgment. The kind that wasn't meant to be subtle. "Ethan," she said lightly, addressing her husband across the table. "Why is she even here?" A few nearby conversations faded. Not completely, just enough. She swirled the wine in her glass, her lips curving into something almost amused. "I thought tonight was for investors," she added, her voice smooth and controlled. Then her gaze returned to me. "Not entertainment." The word landed softly, but the silence that followed didn't. Someone behind her shifted. A server paused mid-step. Two men at the adjacent table exchanged a glance, but said nothing. No one ever does in rooms like this, not when the wrong person is being humiliated. Then another voice joined in. "Her son. Do you even know where you are?" Marcus Carrington stepped forward, tall, polished, carrying the kind of effortless arrogance that comes from never being questioned. "This is a private investor event, not a nightclub." A few people laughed, quietly, uneasily. I noticed something else, though. Across the room, Ethan Carrington, the CEO himself, was watching. And he said nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know. So I set my glass down and made a decision. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe only if this story resonates with something real inside you. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Leave a comment. I read every single one. The next part of this story includes some fictional elements and AI-assisted storytelling created to bring out deeper emotional and educational value. Thank you for being here with me. Now I will tell the story in more detail. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter than I expected. The music softened into a distant echo behind closed doors, replaced by the low hum of air conditioning and the faint rhythm of footsteps passing somewhere far down the corridor. I walked without rushing, each step measured, controlled. Not because I needed time to think, but because I had already made up my mind. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. There was one contact I rarely used, not because it wasn't important, but because it only existed for moments when something had gone fundamentally wrong. Tonight qualified. The call connected after 2 rings. "Escrow operations, this is Adrian Cole speaking." "My name is Amira Stone," I said calmly. "Transaction authorization officer for the Carrington expansion." There was a brief pause on the line, just enough to signal recognition. "Yes, Ms. Stone. How can we assist you? I need to initiate a temporary administrative hold under the reputational governance clause tied to the Carrington escrow release." Silence. Not confusion, not hesitation. The kind of silence that comes when someone understands exactly what that request means. "Are you certain you want to proceed with that action?" he asked carefully. "Yes." My voice didn't change. "I'm submitting a formal reputational incident report. Documentation will follow." A few seconds passed, filled only with the faint sound of typing. "Understood," he replied. "A 72-hour administrative hold can be placed pending legal review. That will be sufficient. More typing. Faster this time. Notifications will be sent to all relevant legal teams, executive signatories, and registered board observers." Correct. Another pause. Then quieter this time, "The hold is now active." I ended the call and lowered the phone slowly. Somewhere behind those ballroom doors, glasses were still clinking. Conversations were still flowing. People were still speaking as if the deal had already been secured. They just didn't know yet. The money had stopped moving. When I stepped back into the ballroom, nothing looked different at first glance. The music continued soft and elegant. Servers moved gracefully between tables, refilling glasses, adjusting plates. Conversations still floated through the air in polished tones, the kind built on confidence and expectation. But something had shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone unfamiliar with high-stakes transactions. A hesitation in the rhythm of voices. A pause before laughter. The quiet glow of phone screens appearing one by one across the room. Near the center table, Ethan Carrington stood, frozen, his gaze fixed on the screen in his hand. The relaxed confidence he carried earlier had tightened into something sharper. Controlled, but strained. "What is this?" he muttered. Beside him, the company's legal advisor, Richard Hale, leaned closer, scanning the message. His expression remained composed, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "It may be procedural," Richard said, his tone measured. "Escrow systems sometimes trigger temporary holds during documentation updates." Ethan didn't respond. Around them, a few investors had already begun checking their own notifications. One man adjusted his glasses, scrolling quickly. Another leaned toward his colleague, whispering something under his breath. Across the table, Lillian Carrington let out a soft, dismissive laugh. "This is ridiculous," she said, lifting her glass again. "You're all acting like the deal just vanished." Her son didn't laugh. Marcus was scanning the room now, irritation flickering across his face, as more phones lit up around him. "Someone made a mistake," he said sharply. "Fix it." No one moved. The tension spread quietly, like a ripple beneath still water. Conversations grew shorter. Voices dropped. Assistants stepped closer to their executives, murmuring updates. I walked back toward the bar and placed my glass exactly where I had left it earlier. Then I waited. Because moments like this don't explode. They unfold. The first person to say it out loud wasn't part of Carrington's team. It was one of the investors. He lowered his phone slowly, eyes moving across the room until they landed on me. There was no hostility in his expression, just calculation. The kind that comes from years of watching deals rise and collapse in the same breath. "Ethan," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to quiet the nearest tables, "there's a simpler question." The room didn't fall silent all at once. It tightened. Who authorized the hold that did it? Conversations stopped. Glasses paused midair. Even the music seemed to fade behind the weight of attention, shifting in a single direction. Toward me. I didn't move immediately. I let the silence settle, let the question exist in the space long enough for its meaning to register. Then I answered. "The transaction compliance signatory." A brief pause followed. Every eye in the room was on me now. That would be me. For a few seconds, no one reacted. It wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. The kind that arrives when something procedural suddenly becomes very real. Ethan looked at me across the ballroom, confusion slowly giving way to concern. "You authorized the hold?" he asked. His voice was controlled, but no longer certain. I nodded once. "Yes." A ripple moved through the investors. Subtle, but unmistakable. Lillian let out a short laugh, shaking her head, as if the entire situation bored her. "Oh, please," she said lightly. "You cannot be serious. This is turning into theater." Marcus stepped forward beside her, his expression hardening. "You froze a $500 million deal." He said each word sharper than the last. Over what exactly? I met his gaze without raising my voice. Over a governance breach tied to reputational risk. Richard Hale's attention sharpened at that. Ethan's brow furrowed. "That clause applies to executive misconduct," he said. "It also applies," I replied calmly, "to disclosed governance affiliates." The room grew very still again. And this time, it stayed that way. Lillian's smile faltered for the first time. It was brief, almost imperceptible. But in a room like this, small changes carried weight. "I'm not part of the company's governance," she said, her tone sharper now. "You're stretching policy to cover your own mistake." I held her gaze. "No," I said quietly. "You are." A few investors shifted in their seats. Phones reappeared in hands, screens lighting up, as documents were pulled from internal systems. In the transaction disclosures submitted to Dominion Trust, I continued, "You are listed as a governance affiliate of the CEO. That places your conduct within the reputational scope of this deal." Richard was already moving, pulling up the agreement on his tablet. His fingers moved quickly, scrolling through dense pages of legal language that most people in the room would never read, but all of them depended on. He stopped. For a moment, he said nothing. Ethan leaned slightly closer. Well, Richard's voice, when it came, was lower than before. Section 14.2, he said. The words didn't sound dramatic, but the effect was immediate. Several investors leaned forward. One of them adjusted his glasses, focusing intently on his own copy of the document. Another exhaled slowly, as if a calculation had just shifted. Lillian let out a small scoff, though it didn't carry the same confidence as earlier. "This is absurd," she said. "You're all entertaining this." No one answered her. Richard lifted his head, looking directly at Ethan now. "She's correct." The sentence landed harder than anything that had been said all evening. Silence followed. Not uncertain this time. Settled. Ethan's posture changed just slightly. His shoulders tightened, his jaw setting as the reality of the situation began to take shape. Across the room, no one was pretending anymore. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a problem. And it had just become everyone's problem. If you believe I was right to enforce the governance clause and stop the deal the moment professionalism was crossed, then I want to hear from you. Drop a 1 in the comments if you would have made the same call, even knowing the consequences. Tension didn't break. It shifted. Marcus stepped forward again this time, without the forced composure he had been holding on to earlier. The confidence was still there, but now it was edged with something sharper, something less controlled. "This is extortion," he said. A few heads turned immediately, the word cutting through the room with more force than anything else that had been said so far. "You embarrass my mother in public," he continued, his voice rising just enough to carry, and suddenly the escrow is frozen. "That's not how governance works," I replied, keeping my tone even. "Don't play games," Marcus snapped. He took another step closer, closing the space between us, as if proximity alone would give him control of the situation. "If you think you can threaten this company because someone hurt your feelings, you're mistaken." Around us, people had stopped pretending not to listen. Every nearby table had gone quiet. "And if you believe you're important enough to stop this deal," he added, his voice dropping now colder, "I can make one call tomorrow and make sure you never work in this industry again." The threat didn't echo. It settled. Heavy. Clear. Deliberate. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then I answered. "This isn't about me," I said calmly. "It's about documented risk." Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "Risk," he repeated. Before I could respond, another voice entered the space. Not loud, not urgent, but it didn't need to be. "That depends." The voice said evenly on whether this is an isolated incident. Heads turned. At the far end of the table, a woman closed a slim leather notebook and looked up. Selena Voss hadn't spoken once that evening. Until now. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Selena Voss simply looked across the table, her expression composed, almost neutral. But there was a precision in her gaze that made people pay attention whether they wanted to or not. Because if it isn't isolated, she continued, then we're not discussing a delay. She paused briefly. We're discussing a pattern. The word settled into the room with quiet weight. Selena reached for her tablet, her movements unhurried, and tapped the screen a few times. A soft vibration followed across several devices at the investor table. Mine included. A document had arrived. Carrington Infrastructure Governance Review. I opened it. The layout was clean structured, stripped of unnecessary language. Just facts, dates, summaries. 2 entries were highlighted. The first described an incident at a charity auction 2 years earlier. A junior staff member had filed a complaint after being publicly humiliated during the event. The matter had been resolved privately. No escalation. The second was from a private investor reception the previous year. A visiting partner had been confronted over seating arrangements. Staff were instructed to remove him from a restricted section. Again, contained quietly. No external reporting. I read both summaries once. Then again. Across the room, several investors were doing the same. No one spoke while they processed it. because the implication didn't require explanation. This wasn't new. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was repetition. I looked up from the screen. Lillian was still standing where she had been, her posture rigid now, her earlier ease replaced with something less certain. She didn't know what was circulating yet, but the room did. And rooms like this make decisions long before anyone announces them. Selena closed her tablet slowly, her eyes moving toward Ethan. This, she said calmly, was already documented. The silence that followed felt different. Not reactive. Decisive. The first calls began within minutes. They weren't loud, they weren't dramatic, but they spread quickly. Several associates stepped away from the main floor, moving toward the quieter edges of the ballroom phones already pressed to their ears. Their voices stayed low-controlled, but the urgency beneath them was impossible to miss. I watched as Selena listened to one call, her expression unchanged, her focus absolute. On the other end were the institutions funding most of the deal. Pension funds, endowments, long-term investors who didn't react often, but when they did, it mattered. "They're asking about governance stability," one analyst said quietly after ending his call. Another added, "and whether family members are influencing operational decisions." That question alone shifted the room, because everyone understood what it implied. Governance risk wasn't abstract, it had consequences. If the deal moved forward under uncertainty, the numbers would change. Risk premiums would increase. Financing terms would tighten. What had looked secure an hour ago could become fragile overnight. Near the center table, Ethan had started pacing. His earlier confidence was gone, now replaced by something sharper, more urgent. He spoke in low tones to Richard fragments of the conversation, carrying just far enough to be heard. "This is being misunderstood," Ethan said. Richard shook his head slightly. "The issue isn't interpretation," he replied. "It's documentation." At another table, Selena's team had gathered laptops, open phones on speaker. They weren't discussing the event anymore. They were conducting an emergency review. Selena ended another call and listened as a voice came through the speaker beside her. "We're reassessing exposure," it said. A brief pause followed. Then more carefully, "We may have backed the wrong company." No one reacted outwardly, but everyone heard it. And once a sentence like that enters a room like this, it doesn't leave. The meeting wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. Within the hour, the senior leadership of Carrington Infrastructure had moved upstairs into a private conference room, leaving the ballroom below to continue its quiet unraveling. Investors remained where they were, but no one was celebrating anymore. Conversations had turned measured, cautious, deliberate. Upstairs, the atmosphere was different. Contained. Controlled. But far more serious. A large screen flickered to life at the far end of the room. One by one, board members appeared, their expressions neutral, their attention already focused. At the center of the call was Eleanor Grant, chair of the Governance Committee and one of the earliest institutional backers of the company. She didn't greet anyone. "I've reviewed the initial report," she said evenly. "Before we discuss the escrow hold, I want a simpler question answered." Her gaze settled on Ethan. "Who is actually running this company?" No one spoke. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, his posture tightening under the weight of the question. "I am," he said. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her attention to Richard. "Legal?" Richard placed a tablet on the table, sliding a document forward, so it was visible to those in the room. The audit trail from the past 12 months, he began carefully, shows multiple instances where operational decisions were altered, following direct involvement from non-executive family members. The wording was precise, but the meaning wasn't. Across the table, Selena spoke without raising her voice. Our internal review reached the same conclusion. She placed several printed pages beside Richard's report. Several approvals were modified under external pressure. Ethan leaned forward. "Those were informal discussions," he said quickly. "Nothing that affected governance structure." Selena met his gaze. "Our analysis suggests otherwise." Silence followed. Through the glass walls of the conference room, The city lights reflected faintly distant and indifferent to what was happening inside. Eleanor closed the file in front of her. "That ends now," she said. No one argued, because in rooms like this, decisions don't need to be repeated to be understood. 2 weeks later, the headlines were written in the careful language corporations prefer when something uncomfortable needs to sound controlled. Leadership transition announced at Carrington Infrastructure. Inside the industry, no one needed further explanation. Ethan Carrington had stepped down as CEO. The official statement described it as a strategic governance restructuring designed to restore investor confidence. In practical terms, it meant the board had taken control. An interim executive was appointed within days, someone with no ties to the family, someone whose authority came from performance, not proximity. The rest followed quickly. A formal resolution removed Lillian Carrington from all governance disclosures tied to investor relations. She was no longer permitted to attend company-sponsored financial events. Quietly but definitively, the access she once treated as entitlement was gone. What didn't appear in the press release circulated elsewhere. Within legal circles, a complaint had been filed: defamation, reputational harm. The incident at the gala had not disappeared. It had simply moved into a different system, one where words carried consequences. The board introduced a new internal policy soon after. Informally, people began calling it the family boundary rule. No relatives of executives were allowed to participate in investor-facing functions. Not as advisors, not as guests. As for Marcus Carrington, the decision was direct. No operational role, no advisory position, no internal access, nothing. The market responded the way it always does when governance cracks become visible. The company's stock dropped. Analysts questioned leadership culture. Reports used careful phrasing, but the message was consistent. Risk had been underestimated. The $500 million expansion didn't collapse. It was restructured. Under new leadership with stricter oversight, with additional governance controls written directly into the agreement. The money began moving again, but this time it moved with conditions. Late one afternoon, I stepped out of the Carrington headquarters and onto the sidewalk. The city carried on without pause. Traffic moved, conversations passed. Nothing about the outside world reflected what had shifted inside that company. I stood there for a moment before walking away. Because the truth was simple. It was never about a single insult. Deals of that size don't stop because of one moment. They stop because of patterns people choose to ignore. And eventually, systems correct what people refuse to. What stayed with me wasn't the insult itself, but how quickly people revealed who they were when power felt unchallenged. Respect isn't tested when everything is smooth. It's tested in small, seemingly insignificant moments, when someone believes they can diminish another person without consequence. And sometimes the most important thing you can do isn't to argue louder, but to stand your ground with clarity and let systems do what they were designed to do. I keep thinking about this. If you were in that room, would you stay silent to protect comfort, or speak through your actions to protect what's right? Because choices like that don't just shape outcomes, they shape who we become. Thank you for being here and staying with this story until the end. If this meant something to you, even a little, consider subscribing. One small action from you can help this story reach someone who needs to hear it. Like a comment or a share might seem simple, but it could be the moment that shifts someone's perspective or gives them the courage to act differently.